Undercover owner saw a black pregnant waitress with a broken hand in his diner. What he discovered left him stunned. "Sir, I can handle this table myself. Please don't worry about my hand." The pregnant waitress's voice trembled as she tried to hide her obviously broken wrist, but James Morrison, disguised as a busboy in his own Atlanta diner, felt his heart shatter as he realized the woman he'd been falling for was suffering in silence just feet from his office door. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comment where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy the story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. The pre-dawn darkness of downtown Atlanta cast long shadows across Peachtree Street as James Morrison unlocked the back door of Morrison's Diner, the flagship location of what had become a 20-restaurant empire across the Southeast. At 36, James had built his fortune from a single food truck in Nashville, but success had come with an unexpected cost. He'd lost touch with the very people who made his dreams possible. His restaurants employed over 800 people across Tennessee, Georgia, and South Carolina, yet James couldn't remember the last time he'd had a real conversation with any of them. Board meetings and profit margins had replaced the joy he'd once found in feeding families, in creating spaces where communities gathered and memories were made. That's why he'd decided on this undercover experiment. For the next 2 weeks, James would work as a busboy in his Atlanta location, using the name Jimmy Martin, and hoping to rediscover what he'd lost in the climb to the top. His management team thought he was on vacation in Costa Rica, a story his assistant was paid handsomely to maintain. The early morning prep work was harder than he remembered. His hands, soft from years of signing contracts instead of washing dishes, already ached from just one day of real work. But it was the people who surprised him most, the kitchen staff who arrived at 5 a.m. with stories of second jobs and night school, the servers who knew every regular customer's order and family drama. And then there was Imani. She arrived each morning at 5:30 a.m. sharp, her natural hair pulled back in a neat bun, her uniform pressed despite the obvious wear around the edges. At 28, she moved through the diner with a grace that suggested dance training, but her eyes carried a wariness that spoke of harder experiences. James had noticed her immediately, not just because she was beautiful, though undeniably she was, but because of how she treated everyone around her. She remembered the homeless man's name when she gave him free coffee. She asked the elderly regulars about their grandchildren. She worked every shift with a quiet dignity that commanded respect from customers and coworkers alike. What James didn't know, yet, was the weight Imani carried beyond her obvious pregnancy. Meanwhile, Imani Washington stood at the bathroom mirror in her small apartment in East Point, carefully applying concealer to the bruises on her wrist and forearm. The cast would have been too obvious, too many questions, so she'd wrapped the broken bones in an ACE bandage and prayed she could make it through another shift without anyone noticing. 6 months pregnant and barely making rent on her waitressing salary, Imani couldn't afford to miss work. Not when her ex-boyfriend Derek had made it clear that he expected his loans to be repaid, broken hand or not. The bones would heal, they always did. But losing her job at Morrison's Diner would mean losing everything. She'd been working there for 8 months, ever since she'd finally escaped Derek's increasingly violent outbursts and moved out of their shared apartment in College Park. The job paid well enough to cover her studio apartment and prenatal vitamins, with just enough left over for the slowly growing collection of baby clothes she kept hidden in her closet. The other servers at Morrison's had become like family, the closest thing to stability she'd had since aging out of foster care at 18. Maria, the veteran waitress, had taught her which customers tipped well and which ones to avoid. Tommy, the cook, always made sure she ate during her shifts, claiming the extra food would just go to waste anyway. But it was the new busboy, Jimmy, who had started occupying more of her thoughts than she cared to admit. He was different from the usual revolving door of part-time workers. Older, more serious, with hands that looked like they'd seen more keyboard than kitchen work. But he was kind, genuinely kind, not the performative kindness she'd learned to distrust from men. Yesterday, when she'd nearly dropped a tray because of the shooting pain in her wrist, Jimmy had appeared at her elbow like magic, steadying the plates without making a big deal of it. When she'd tried to thank him, he'd just smiled and said, "We all need help sometimes." If only he knew how desperately she needed help now. Have you ever had to hide an injury or struggle to keep working? What would you want your coworkers to know? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The morning routine was always the same. Check the bandage, practice her smile in a mirror, and remind herself that she'd survived worse than Derek's parting gift of broken bones. She would survive this too. What Imani didn't know was that the man she was starting to care about was actually her boss, and he was about to discover the truth she'd been hiding, a truth that would change everything for both of them. The morning rush at Morrison's diner hit like a hurricane at 7 a.m., transforming the peaceful prep space into controlled chaos. James, still playing his role as Jimmy the busboy, moved between tables with growing appreciation for the physical demands of restaurant work. His back ached, his feet throbbed, but his eyes never strayed far from Imani as she navigated her section with practiced efficiency. Something was wrong. He'd noticed it yesterday, but now it was impossible to ignore. The way she favored her left hand, how she winced when lifting heavy trays, the careful way she positioned herself to use her hip for opening doors instead of her right arm. "Order up," Tommy called from the kitchen, sliding 2 plates across the pass. "Table 6, Imani." James watched as she approached the counter, her face tightening almost imperceptibly as she reached for the plates. The breakfast special, eggs, bacon, hash browns, and biscuits, wasn't particularly heavy, but she hesitated for just a moment before lifting the tray. That hesitation told him everything. "Let me help with that," James said quietly, stepping beside her. "I'm fine, Jimmy." "Really?" But even as she spoke, he could see the slight tremor in her right hand, the way she kept it close to her body. The morning crowd was relentless. Business people grabbing quick breakfasts before heading to offices in Buckhead, construction workers fueling up for long days, regulars who'd been coming to Morrison since James first opened the location 5 years ago. Each table required multiple trips, heavy trays, and constant movement. And Imani powered through it all with a grace that was breaking James's heart. By 9 a.m., the breakfast rush had settled into a manageable flow. James was wiping down tables when he heard the crash. The sound of breaking plates echoed through the diner like a gunshot, followed by absolute silence. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned toward table 12, where Imani stood frozen, staring at the shattered remains of what had been a full breakfast order. "Oh God, I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry." The customer, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, stood up abruptly, coffee staining his white shirt. "Are you kidding me? This is a brand new shirt. Do you have any idea how much this cost?" "Sir, I'll pay for the cleaning, "You'll pay for it." The man's voice rose, attracting more attention. "On a waitress salary? This shirt costs more than you make in a week." James felt something dangerous rise in his chest. In his real life, he would have fired customers for speaking to his employees this way. But Jimmy the busboy had no such authority. "I'll get you another order right away," Imani said, dropping to her knees to gather the broken pieces with her left hand. Her right arm remained pressed against her side, and James could see her trying not to cry. "Forget the order." I want to speak to the manager. This is completely unacceptable. Maria, the senior waitress, appeared with a towel and a replacement shirt from the Lost and Found. Sir, accidents happen. Let me take care of. I don't want you to take care of anything. I want her fired. The man pointed directly at Imani, who was still kneeling on the floor, carefully picking up glass shards. Someone this clumsy has no business working around food. That's when James saw it. As Imani reached for a larger piece of broken plate, her sleeve rode up just enough to reveal what she'd been hiding. Dark purple bruising wrapped around her wrist like a twisted bracelet, and the unnatural angle of her hand made it clear that bones had been broken recently. The breath left James's lungs in a rush. This wasn't clumsiness. This was a woman working through significant injury, probably because she couldn't afford not to work. She's hurt, James said quietly, moving toward table 12. What? The angry customer turned toward him. She's hurt, James repeated, louder now. Look at her wrist. She's working with broken bones. Imani's head snapped up, her eyes wide with panic. Jimmy, please. But James was already kneeling beside her, gently taking her left hand to prevent her from handling more glass. Up close, he could see the careful concealer work around her wrist, the way she held her entire right side protectively. Ma'am, James said softly, using every ounce of restraint not to demand answers about who had hurt her. You need medical attention. I can't, she whispered, so quietly only he could hear. I can't afford to miss work. The customer was still ranting about his shirt, but James blocked him out entirely. The only thing that mattered was the woman in front of him, injured and afraid, trying to hold her world together with sheer determination. How long? James asked. 3 days, Imani admitted, tears finally spilling over. It happened 3 days ago. 3 days. She'd been working for 3 days with broken bones, serving food, lifting trays, smiling at customers, all while hiding what must have been excruciating pain. We're taking you to the hospital, James said firmly. I can't afford. I'll cover it. The words came out before he could stop them. Jimmy the busboy shouldn't have had insurance or emergency funds. But James Morrison couldn't watch this woman suffer in silence for another second. Maria knelt beside them, her experienced eyes taking in the situation immediately. Honey, why didn't you tell us? Because I need this job, Imani said through tears. I need this job and I can't. Her voice broke completely. James helped her to her feet, his mind racing. The angry customer was still demanding action, other diners were staring, and the woman he'd been secretly falling for was falling apart in his arms. But in that moment of crisis, something crystallized for James Morrison. All the profit margins and expansion plans and board meetings meant nothing compared to the human being trembling beside him. The empire he'd built was worthless if it couldn't protect the people who made it possible. I'm taking you to Grady Hospital, he said, making a decision that would change everything. Right now. Jimmy, you don't understand. I understand more than you know, James said quietly, and for the first time in days, he meant every word. As he helped Imani toward the door, leaving chaos and questions in their wake, James realized that his undercover experiment had revealed something he never expected to find. Not just the flaws in his business, but the woman who was about to become his whole world. The Monday morning shift at Morrison's Diner started like any other, but James couldn't stop replaying the weekend's revelations in his mind. Every time he looked at Imani, gracefully navigating between tables despite her obvious pain, he felt a mixture of admiration and rage that threatened to blow his cover. He'd spent his Sunday researching domestic violence resources in Atlanta, calling anonymous hotlines to understand what Imani might be going through. The statistics were staggering. 1 in 4 women experienced intimate partner violence, but pregnant women were at even higher risk. The knowledge sat in his stomach like lead. "Jimmy, table 6 needs their water glasses refilled," Imani said softly as she passed him near the kitchen, her good hand balancing a tray of steaming plates. The simple interaction felt loaded with everything he now knew and couldn't say. "Of course. You okay? You look tired." Imani's smile was automatic, practiced. "Just pregnancy stuff. Nothing I can't handle. I can handle this." The phrase had become her armor, but James could see the cracks. The way she favored her left side. The slight wince when she reached for anything above shoulder height. The dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights filled with more than just baby kicks. As James refilled water glasses at table 6, he overheard Mrs. Patterson, one of the regulars, talking to her friend. "That sweet pregnant girl, Imani. She's been limping all week. I wanted to ask what happened, but you know how private she is." "Probably just pregnancy aches," her companion replied. "Though she does seem more jumpy lately. Last week when that man raised his voice about his order being wrong, she practically jumped out of her skin." James's grip tightened on the water pitcher. The pieces were forming a picture he didn't want to complete, but his mind couldn't stop connecting the dots. Imani's reluctance to discuss her personal life. The way she checked her phone constantly, as if expecting bad news. The apartment in East Point she'd mentioned. Far from family or support systems. The lunch rush brought a temporary distraction, but James found himself positioning himself closer to Imani whenever possible, ready to step in if she needed help. It was during the 2 p.m. lull that everything came to a head. Derek Washington walked through the front door of Morrison's Diner like he owned the place. James recognized him instantly from the weekend's social media investigation. Tall, muscular, with the kind of swagger that screamed danger to anyone paying attention. He wore an expensive tracksuit and gold chains that caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows. Imani was refilling the coffee station when she noticed him. James watched her entire body language change. Shoulders tensing, movements becoming smaller, more careful. She glanced toward the kitchen as if calculating escape routes. "There's my baby mama," Derek announced loudly enough for half the restaurant to hear. Several customers looked up from their meals, sensing the shift in atmosphere. "Derek, what are you doing here?" Imani's voice was steady, but James could see her good hand trembling as she set down the coffee pot. "Can't a man check on his woman and his kid?" Derek's smile was all teeth, no warmth. "Especially when she's been ignoring my calls. We talked about this. I told you I needed space." "Space?" Derek's laugh was harsh. "Baby, you're carrying my child. There ain't no space in that equation." James positioned himself behind the counter, close enough to intervene but trying to appear busy with inventory. Every instinct screamed at him to step between them, but he forced himself to wait, to watch, to understand the full scope of what Imani was dealing with. "I'm at work, Derek. Please don't do this here." Imani's plea was quiet, dignified, but James could hear the fear underneath. "Do what?" "Talk to my girl." Derek stepped closer, and James noticed how Imani automatically moved backward. "You look good, Imani. Pregnancy suits you. Though I heard you had a little accident last week." The way he said accident made James's blood run cold. "I fell," Imani said quickly. "It was nothing. Funny how clumsy you got after our conversation about responsibility." Derek's voice dropped low, but in the quiet restaurant, James caught every word. About taking care of family business instead of playing house with strangers. Maria, the veteran waitress, appeared beside Imani like a protective shield. At 55, she'd raised 4 kids and had zero tolerance for men who intimidated women. "Sir, if you're not ordering food, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," Maria said firmly. "This is a family establishment." Derek's eyes flashed dangerously. "Family? Lady, that's exactly what I'm talking about. This woman is carrying my family. And this woman has made it clear she doesn't want to talk to you," Maria shot back. "So like I said, order something or leave." The tension in the restaurant was thick enough to cut. Other customers had stopped eating entirely, some pulling out phones, others looking toward the exits. James realized that whatever happened next would define not just this moment, but possibly Imani's entire future. "You know what?" Derek's smile returned, but it was predatory now. "I'll take a coffee. Black. And I'll sit right there where I can keep an eye on things." He pointed to table 12, the one with a perfect view of the entire restaurant and both exits. "Sure thing," Maria said through gritted teeth. "Imani, why don't you take your break? I've got this." But as Imani turned toward the back room, Derek's voice stopped her. "Baby, don't be rude. Stay and chat with me while I drink my coffee. We got things to discuss about our future." It wasn't a request. James watched Imani's shoulders slump in defeat, and something inside him snapped. The careful planning, the need to maintain his cover, the complex considerations about business and liability. All of it evaporated in the face of watching someone he cared about being trapped. "Actually," James said, stepping forward with the coffee pot, "our policy is that employees on break don't interact with customers. Company rules." Derek's attention shifted to him for the first time. "And you are?" "Jimmy. I work here." James met Derek's stare without flinching. "And like the lady said, this is a family place. We keep things peaceful." "Peaceful," Derek repeated slowly, his eyes cataloging James from head to toe. "That's good. I like peace. Don't you, Imani?" The question was loaded with threat, and James realized that his intervention might have just made things worse for Imani. But as he looked at her face, saw the mixture of gratitude and terror in her eyes, he knew he couldn't have stayed silent. "Your coffee, sir," James said, setting the cup down harder than necessary. A few drops splashed onto the table. "Careful there, Jimmy," Derek said softly. "Accidents happen so easy around here." The message was crystal clear, and James felt his carefully constructed busboy persona beginning to crack under the pressure of wanting to throw this man through the plate glass window. Instead, he smiled and said, "You're right. Good thing we have excellent insurance." It was a subtle threat wrapped in polite conversation, and Derek's eyes narrowed as he tried to figure out if the busboy was more than he seemed. The standoff continued for another tense minute before Derek finally picked up his coffee and took a sip. "This is good coffee, Jimmy. Real good. I think I might start coming here regular like." The promise felt like a noose tightening around all their necks, but James simply nodded and said, "We're open every day." As Derek nursed his coffee and Imani reluctantly returned to work under his watchful gaze, James realized that his undercover experiment had just become something much more dangerous and personal than he'd ever intended. He was falling in love with a woman who was trapped, and the man trapping her had just declared war on anyone who tried to help her. The question was, how far was James willing to go to protect her, and how much was he willing to risk to set her free? The emergency room at Grady Hospital buzzed with typical Atlanta chaos. Ambulance sirens, crying children, and the perpetual understaffing that made waiting times stretch into eternity. James sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair next to Amani's bed in the observation area, still wearing his busboy uniform, his cover story becoming more complicated by the hour. "You really don't have to stay," Imani said for the third time, though her voice lacked conviction. The pain medication had dulled the sharp agony in her wrist, but it had also lowered her usual defenses. "I'm sure you have somewhere else you need to be." James looked up from the insurance paperwork he'd been quietly handling. Another red flag that a simple busboy probably shouldn't be able to navigate so easily. "I'm exactly where I need to be," he said firmly. "Besides, someone needs to make sure you actually follow the doctor's orders this time." The X-rays had confirmed what James suspected. Multiple fractures in her wrist, some old, some recent, all consistent with defensive injuries. Dr. Sarah Chen, the attending physician, had pulled James aside with the kind of professional discretion that came from years of seeing domestic violence cases. "The pattern suggests repeated trauma," Dr. Chen had explained quietly. "Has she mentioned anything about her home situation?" James had felt his chest tighten with a rage he hadn't experienced since childhood, when he'd watched his own mother make excuses for bruises that came from nowhere. But he'd simply shook his head, knowing that Amani's trust would have to be earned, not demanded. Now, as they waited for the orthopedic surgeon to review her case, James found himself in the strange position of maintaining his cover while desperately wanting to reveal the truth. Every instinct screamed at him to tell her who he really was, to promise that she'd never have to worry about money or insurance or working with broken bones again. But he'd seen the way she stiffened when the hospital administrator had mentioned the cost of surgery. He'd watched her calculate whether she could afford to miss work for recovery. He knew that revealing his identity now would feel like pity, and Amani Washington was too proud for pity. "Jimmy," her voice was softer now, the pain medication making her more vulnerable than she'd normally allow. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything. Why are you really here? And don't say it's because we work together. I've seen busboys come and go at Morrison's, and none of them would spend their day off in a hospital with a pregnant waitress they barely know." James felt the weight of deception pressing against his chest. The truth was so much more complicated than she could imagine, that he'd fallen for her strength, her kindness, her quiet dignity. That watching someone hurt her had awakened something fierce and protective in him that he'd never felt before. "Maybe I care more than most people," he said carefully. "But why?" The question hung between them, loaded with all the vulnerability she usually kept hidden. "Men don't usually. I mean, look at me. 6 months pregnant, broke, obviously running from something. I'm not exactly a catch." The casual dismissal of her own worth hit James like a physical blow. "You're wrong about that," he said quietly. "You're completely wrong." Before Amani could respond, the curtain swept open and Dr. Chen returned with a tablet full of scans and a serious expression. "I've reviewed your X-rays with the orthopedic team," she began, pulling up a chair. "The good news is that we can repair the fractures, but it's going to require surgery and at least 6 weeks of recovery time with no lifting, no repetitive motion." James watched Imani's face crumble as the implications sank in. 6 weeks without work meant 6 weeks without income, which meant losing her apartment, which meant... "Doctor," James interrupted, "what would happen if she didn't have the surgery?" Dr. Chen's expression grew stern. "Permanent damage. Loss of mobility in that hand. Given that you're pregnant, Ms. Washington, you're going to need full use of both hands to care for your baby." "I can't afford 6 weeks off work," Imani whispered, her hand moving instinctively to her belly. "I can't afford the surgery either." "Actually," James said, making a decision that would complicate his cover story exponentially, "money isn't going to be a problem. Both women looked at him sharply. Dr. Chen with professional curiosity, Imani with suspicion and growing alarm. "What do you mean?" Imani's voice was tight. James pulled out his phone, not the basic model he'd been carrying as Jimmy the busboy, but his actual iPhone, the one with direct lines to hospital administrators and insurance executives. "I mean, I'm going to make some calls. The restaurant has better insurance than you think, and I know people who can help navigate the system." "Jimmy, busboys don't have connections with hospital administrators," Imani said slowly. Her eyes narrowing as pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite solve began falling into place. "Some busboys do," James said weakly, knowing his cover was rapidly disintegrating. Dr. Chen, sensing the tension, diplomatically excused herself. "I'll give you both some time to discuss this. But Ms. Washington, we really do need to schedule that surgery soon." Alone again behind the thin curtain, Imani stared at James with new eyes. The expensive watch he'd forgotten to remove. The way he'd handled the insurance paperwork without hesitation. The phone call he was clearly prepared to make to people who could solve problems that minimum wage workers weren't supposed to have solutions for. "Who are you really?" she asked quietly. James looked into her eyes that had seen too much betrayal, too much disappointment, and felt the walls of his deception crumbling. But before he could answer, Imani's phone buzzed with a text message that made her face go white with fear. She fumbled for the phone with her good hand, and James caught a glimpse of the message. "Found out where you work. You can run, but you can't hide from what you owe me. D." "Imani, who is D?" She was shaking now, the color completely drained from her face. "I have to go. I have to leave the hospital right now." "Like hell you do," James said firmly, moving to block her path as she tried to get up from the bed. "You're having surgery, and then you're going somewhere safe." "You don't understand," she whispered, tears starting to fall. "He found me. Derek found out where I work, which means he knows where I live, and he's going to." "He's not going to do anything," James interrupted, his voice carrying an authority that no busboy should possess. "Not to you, not to your baby, not while I'm here." Imani looked up at him through her tears, seeing something in his eyes that she'd never seen from any man before. Absolute, unshakable protection. "Jimmy, I don't know who you really are, but I can't drag you into this. Derek is dangerous, and when he gets angry." "Then it's a good thing I'm not afraid of dangerous men," James said quietly. "And it's a very good thing that I have resources he doesn't know about." "Resources? Jimmy, what are you talking about?" James took her uninjured hand in both of his, feeling the weight of the moment. "I'm talking about the fact that I'm not going to let anyone hurt you again. Ever." "But you barely know me." "I know enough," he said softly. "I know you give free coffee to homeless veterans. I know you remember every regular customer's name. I know you work through pain because you're too proud to ask for help. I know you're brave and kind and stronger than anyone should have to be. Jimmy. And I know that I'm falling in love with you, which means Derek is about to become my problem, not yours." The confession hung in the air between them, changing everything. Imani stared at him, seeing past the busboy uniform to the man underneath. A man with secrets, yes, but also a man who had just promised to stand between her and the violence she'd been running from. "You can't love me," she whispered. "You don't even know me." "Then tell me," James said simply. "Tell me everything and let me help you." Outside the curtain, the hospital continued its chaotic rhythm, but inside their small space, time seemed suspended. Two people with secrets, sitting in the ruins of their carefully constructed walls, deciding whether to trust each other with the truth. Imani looked at her phone, at Derek's threatening message, then back at Jimmy, or whatever his real name was. For the first time in her adult life, she wasn't facing her demons alone. The silence in James's apartment stretched between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Imani sat on his couch, her broken wrist properly splinted now thanks to his friend Dr. Martinez, while James made tea in his kitchen, his hand shaking slightly as he processed everything she told him. Derek Williams. The name burned in James's mind like acid. The man who had systematically isolated Imani from her friends, controlled her finances, and finally broken her wrist when she tried to leave with his baby growing inside her. "You don't have to tell me anything else," James said softly, returning with 2 steaming mugs. "But I want you to know, whatever you've been through, it doesn't change how I see you." Imani accepted the tea gratefully, wrapping her good hand around the warm ceramic. "You say that now, but you don't know the whole story." "Then tell me." James sat across from her, careful to maintain distance while making it clear he wasn't going anywhere. "I've got all night." Something in his voice, the genuine patience, the lack of judgment, cracked open a door in Imani's heart that had been locked for years. Maybe it was the exhaustion, maybe it was the relief of finally having someone care about her well-being, but she found herself speaking truths she'd never said aloud. "I met Derek 2 years ago at a community college career fair in Decatur," she began, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. "He was recruiting for his construction company, and I was trying to figure out how to pay for nursing school. He was charming, successful, everything I thought I wanted." James listened without interrupting, noting how her shoulders tensed with each memory. "At first, it was perfect. He paid for my textbooks, took me to nice restaurants in Buckhead, made me feel like I mattered. I'd never had someone take care of me like that before." Imani's laugh was bitter. "I should have known it was too good to be true." "What happened?" "The control started slowly. He didn't like my study group. Said those girls were filling my head with feminist nonsense. Then he didn't want me working the late shift at my old job because it wasn't safe for his woman to be out after dark. Everything was about protecting me, taking care of me." James recognized the pattern. He'd seen it in the stories of several employees over the years, the gradual erosion of independence disguised as love. By the time I realized what was happening, I was completely dependent on him. He'd moved me into his apartment in College Park, convinced me to quit school because he could provide for both of us. I had no friends left, no money of my own, nowhere to go. "But you got out," James said quietly. "You found Morrison's, you found your independence again." Imani nodded, but her expression darkened. "I got pregnant 6 months ago. When I told Derek, he was furious. Said a baby would ruin his plans, that I'd done it on purpose to trap him. That's when the hitting started." James's hands clenched into fists, but he kept his voice gentle. "What made you finally leave?" "He came home drunk one night last month, screaming about how I was ruining his life. When I tried to calm him down, he shoved me into the wall. I felt the baby move right after, like she was trying to tell me we had to get out." Imani's hand moved protectively to her belly. "I waited until he passed out, grabbed what I could carry and left. Found my apartment through a church shelter program." "And he followed you." "Derek doesn't like losing control of his possessions," Imani said with a bitter smile. "He found out where I was working, started showing up at the diner during my shifts, making scenes, claiming I owed him money for rent and groceries while we were together. 2 nights ago, he cornered me in the parking lot after closing." James's jaw tightened. "That's when he broke your wrist." He said it was a reminder that I belonged to him, that carrying his baby meant I always would. He'll be back, Jimmy. Men like Derek don't just give up. The name Jimmy hit James like a physical blow. Here was this incredible woman, pouring her heart out to him, and she didn't even know his real name. She didn't know he had the power to protect her, to make Derek disappear from their lives forever. But more than that, she didn't know that he'd been falling in love with her courage, her strength, her incredible capacity for kindness despite everything she'd endured. Imani, James said carefully, what if I told you that you never have to worry about Derek again, that there are ways to make sure he can't hurt you anymore? She looked at him skeptically. Jimmy, you're a busboy at a diner. What could you possibly do against someone like Derek? He has money, connections, a business. People like us don't win against people like him. The phrase people like us broke something inside James's chest. She saw them as equals. Two working-class people struggling to get by, looking out for each other because that's what good people do. She had no idea that he could buy and sell Derek's construction company without even checking his account balance. Sometimes, James said slowly, people aren't who they seem to be. Imani studied his face, noting something in his expression she couldn't quite identify. What do you mean? James stood up, walking to his kitchen window that overlooked downtown Atlanta's glittering skyline. The Marriott, the Georgia Pacific Tower, the Bank of America Plaza. All buildings where he'd conducted business, where his success was measured in square footage and quarterly reports. I mean that Derek isn't the only one with resources. There are people, good people, who can help when the system fails women like you. You're talking about shelters, legal aid lawyers who are too busy to return phone calls, Imani said wearily. I've tried all that. The system isn't built for people like me. James turned back to her, his decision crystallizing. She deserved the truth. Not all of it, not yet, but enough to let her know that she wasn't as powerless as she believed. What if I told you I know people? Lawyers who actually answer their phones, private investigators who can document Derek's harassment, security companies that specialize in protecting women from abusive ex-partners. Imani's eyes narrowed. How would a busboy know people like that? Because, James said, his heart pounding, I haven't been entirely honest with you about who I am. The silence that followed was deafening. Imani set down her teacup, her good hand trembling slightly. Who are you? She whispered. James looked at this woman who had trusted him with her deepest fears, who had worked with broken bones to provide for her unborn child, who had shown him more genuine kindness in 2 weeks than he'd received in years of business relationships. My name isn't Jimmy Martin, he said quietly. It's James Morrison, and I own the diner where we work. The color drained from Imani's face. She stared at him for a long moment, then slowly, deliberately stood up. You've been lying to me this whole time. Her voice was flat, emotionless, the same tone she'd used when describing Derek's abuse. Imani, please let me explain. Explain what? That you've been playing dress-up, pretending to be poor while I've been struggling to pay for prenatal vitamins? That you've been watching me like I'm some kind of social experiment? It wasn't like that. Then what was it like, Mr. Morrison? The formality in her voice cut deeper than any anger could have. Was it fun, playing pretend with the desperate pregnant girl? Did you get a good laugh watching me try to hide my broken wrist so I wouldn't lose the job you could have given me a raise on with a snap of your fingers? James reached for her, but she stepped back, wrapping her arms protectively around herself. I was falling in love with you, she said, her voice breaking. With Jimmy, The kind busboy who made me feel like maybe I deserved something good for once. But Jimmy doesn't exist, does he? He's just another lie from another man who thought he could control me. Imani, please. But she was already moving toward the door, her dignity intact even as her world crumbled around her. Don't worry, Mr. Morrison. I'll clean out my locker tomorrow. I'm sure you can find another charity case to feel sorry for. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and James was left alone with the devastating realization that in trying to protect her, he'd become just another man who'd lied to her, just another person who'd made her feel small. Outside, Atlanta's skyline glittered with promise and possibility, but all James could see was the look of betrayal in Imani's eyes, and the terrifying knowledge that he might have lost the only real thing he'd found in years. The rain had stopped by the time James and Imani reached Piedmont Park, but the evening air still carried the fresh scent of wet earth and blooming dogwoods. They walked slowly along the path that circled the lake, neither wanting to rush this moment that felt both inevitable and impossible. I can't believe you've been living in Atlanta for 2 years and never been here, Imani said, gesturing toward the skyline visible through the trees. This is where I come when the world gets too loud. James smiled, though his heart ached knowing she'd needed escape so often. Show me your favorite spot. She led him to a bench overlooking the water, where families of ducks paddled peacefully in the golden light of sunset. The Atlanta skyline rose beyond the trees, a perfect backdrop that James had seen from his penthouse windows but never appreciated like this, through her eyes. I used to bring a book here when I first moved to the city, Imani said, settling carefully onto the bench. I was so scared, 26 years old, and felt like I was starting life over again. What changed? James asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Derek. Her voice was barely a whisper. I thought he was saving me, but he was just collecting me. Like I was something he could own. James felt his hands clench into fists, but forced himself to remain calm. You don't have to tell me everything tonight. I want to. She turned to face him, her brown eyes reflecting the lake's surface. I've never had someone who just listened, without trying to fix me or judge me or take advantage. The vulnerability in her voice nearly broke him. Here was this incredible woman, strong, compassionate, beautiful, who had been made to feel like she was too much trouble, too damaged, not worth gentle treatment. Imani, he said softly, you're not broken. You're not too much. You're exactly enough. Tears spilled over her cheeks, and James reached out instinctively to catch them with his thumb. The gesture was so tender, so natural, that neither of them questioned it. The baby, she whispered, placing her good hand on her rounded belly. Derek said no one would ever want a woman carrying another man's child. That I should be grateful he put up with me. Derek is an idiot, James said with such conviction that Imani actually laughed through her tears. Any man would be honored to love you and this baby. Even you. The question slipped out before she could stop it. Vulnerable and hopeful and terrifying. James felt his carefully constructed walls crumble completely. Especially me. The kiss was soft, tentative, a question asked and answered with the brush of lips under the Georgia sunset. When they parted, Imani was crying again, but these were different tears. I'm scared, she admitted. I've never felt this way about anyone, and I don't know how to trust it. We'll figure it out together, James promised, though guilt gnawed at him. He was falling in love with her honesty while living the biggest lie of his life. They talked until the park lights came on, sharing stories that painted fuller pictures of their lives. Imani told him about the foster homes, the social workers who meant well but never stayed long enough to matter, the teachers who saw potential in a girl everyone else had written off. James found himself sharing truths he'd never told anyone. How success had isolated him, how he missed his grandmother's kitchen where his love of food had begun, how he sometimes felt like he was playing a role in his own life. "What's your real dream?" Imani asked as they walked back toward her apartment. "Not what you do for work, but what makes you feel alive." The question hit him like a physical blow. When was the last time someone had asked him what he wanted, not what he could provide? "I used to want to feed people," he said slowly. "Not just serve food, but create places where families could gather, where communities could grow." Sounds stupid now. "It sounds beautiful," Imani said firmly. "Why did you stop? Life gets complicated. Bills to pay, people depending on you." He was describing his journey from food truck to empire without revealing the scale. "Maybe it doesn't have to be complicated," she suggested. "Maybe you could start small again. Find your way back to what matters." They stopped in front of her building, neither wanting the evening to end. The apartment complex was modest but well-maintained, with a small garden where residents had planted flowers that were just beginning to bloom. "Jimmy," Imani said, then paused. "That night Derek hurt me. I thought I was done trusting men. I thought I'd rather be alone forever than risk feeling that helpless again." "And now?" James asked, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "Now I think maybe I was just waiting for the right man to show me what real protection feels like." She rose on her tiptoes and kissed his cheek. "Thank you for seeing me. The real me." As she disappeared into her building, James stood on the sidewalk feeling like his entire world had shifted on its axis. He was in love, completely, terrifyingly, wonderfully in love, with a woman who knew him as a busboy named Jimmy Martin. The deception that had started as a business experiment now felt like a betrayal of the most important relationship of his life. Every moment of genuine connection was built on a foundation of lies, and James had no idea how to fix it without losing her forever. His phone buzzed with a text from his assistant. "Board meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. to discuss the Q3 expansion. Need you back." The reminder of his real life felt like a slap. Tomorrow he would sit in a conference room worth more than Imani made in 5 years, making decisions that affected thousands of employees he'd never met. Tonight he'd held the hand of one employee who mattered more than all the profit margins in the world. Have you ever fallen in love with someone while hiding who you really are? How do you think James should handle this impossible situation? Share your thoughts below. As James walked back toward his hotel, he made a decision that would either save their love or destroy it completely. It was time to tell Imani the truth. All of it. Her reaction would determine whether their story was a beautiful beginning or a devastating end. But first, he had one more day as Jimmy Martin. One more day to love her without the complications of corporate empires and class differences. One more day to pretend that love was simple and pure and enough to overcome any obstacle. He just prayed that when tomorrow came, the truth wouldn't shatter the most beautiful thing that had ever happened to either of them. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Morrison's diner as James sat in his real office. Not the janitor's closet where Jimmy Martin kept his supplies, but the executive suite on the second floor with its mahogany desk and panoramic view of Atlanta's skyline. 3 days had passed since he'd revealed his identity to Imani. 3 days since he'd held her as she cried in his arms. 3 days since he'd promised her that everything would be different. But everything was falling apart. His phone buzzed incessantly with calls from his legal team, his board of directors, and reporters who had somehow gotten wind of the story. The headline in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution that morning made his stomach turn. Restaurant mogul's secret romance, exploitation or love? Derek's lawsuit had been filed yesterday, claiming that James Morrison had manipulated and coerced a vulnerable employee, taking advantage of her desperate financial situation for his own gratification. The $20 million claim included allegations of workplace harassment, emotional distress, and predatory behavior toward a pregnant woman in crisis. James knew it was all lies, but lies printed in newspapers and broadcast on morning shows had a way of becoming truth in the court of public opinion. His phone rang again. Marcus Thompson, his business partner and oldest friend, didn't wait for pleasantries. "James, you need to end this now. The board is meeting this afternoon, and they're talking about removing you as CEO. Stock prices are down 12% since yesterday. Marcus, you know me better than. I know you're thinking with the wrong head." Marcus's voice cracked with frustration. "This woman. Her name is Imani. This woman has destroyed everything we built. Do you understand what Derek Williams is saying in these depositions? He's claiming you knew about her situation from day one, that you deliberately kept her desperate so she'd be grateful enough to sleep with you." James felt bile rise in his throat. "That's not what happened, and you know it. What I know doesn't matter. What matters is that in 6 hours, the board is going to vote on your removal unless you can make this go away. And the only way to make it go away is to distance yourself from her completely." The line went dead, leaving James alone with the weight of an impossible choice. Across town in her East Point apartment, Imani sat on her couch surrounded by legal documents she couldn't afford to have a lawyer explain. Derek had been thorough in his character assassination, painting her as a gold digger who had seduced her wealthy boss for financial gain, a woman who had deliberately hidden her pregnancy and injury to manipulate his sympathy. The lies were so detailed, so convincingly twisted from fragments of truth, that even Imani began to question her own motivations. Had she unconsciously encouraged James's attention? Had she allowed herself to fall for him because of his money rather than his character? Her phone hadn't stopped ringing for 2 days. Reporters, bloggers, strangers who had somehow gotten her number and wanted to share their opinions about her life choices. She'd finally turned it off, but the silence was almost worse than the harassment. Maria knocked on her door around noon, carrying groceries and the kind of stern expression that meant business. "Mija, you look terrible." "I feel terrible." Imani's voice was hoarse from crying. "Maria, what if they're right? What if I did lead him on because he was successful? What if—" "Stop." Maria set down the groceries and took Imani's hands. "I've been working in restaurants for 20 years. I know the difference between a man who's using his power and a man who's using his heart. Jimmy, James, whatever his name is, he looked at you like you hung the moon. But the board is going to fire him. The restaurants might be ruined. All because he tried to help me. And that's his choice to make, not yours." Imani shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I can't let him lose everything for me. I'm not worth destroying an empire. Don't you dare." Maria's voice was fierce. "Don't you dare make yourself small to make other people comfortable. That man chose you, knowing exactly what it might cost him. If you walk away now, you're not protecting him. You're proving Derek right." But as the afternoon wore on and the news coverage grew more vicious, Imani felt herself shrinking under the weight of public scrutiny. The comments on social media were brutal. Gold-digging baby mama, welfare queen who hit the jackpot, lying about abuse to get sympathy. Each word was a knife, but the worst part was knowing that James was reading the same comments, facing the same judgment, losing everything he'd worked for because he'd fallen in love with the wrong woman. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Leave him alone or lose more than your job. You know what I'm capable of. D. Derek wasn't done destroying her life. Now he was threatening James too. At 4 p.m., James sat in the Morrison Industries boardroom facing 12 people who had once been his allies. The mahogany table that had hosted celebrations of new restaurant openings and record profits now felt like a tribunal. The situation is untenable, announced Helen Carter, the board chair who had mentored James for over a decade. The negative publicity is affecting all our locations. We've had 3 franchisees threaten to break their contracts, and our insurance company is reviewing our liability policies. This will blow over, James said, though his voice lacked conviction. Will it? Richard Vaughn, the company's largest outside investor, slid a tablet across the table. Have you seen what's trending on social media? #PredatoryBoss. #Morrison Scandal. This isn't going away, James. It's getting worse. James looked at the screen, his heart sinking at the thousands of comments dissecting every aspect of his relationship with Imani. The internet had tried and convicted them both without knowing a single true detail of their story. We've prepared a severance package, Helen continued. It's generous. More than generous. You step down as CEO, maintain your stock options, and we'll provide a statement saying this was a planned transition. You can rebuild somewhere else, but you can't do it here. And if I refuse, then we vote you out today, and you leave with nothing but your original shares. No severance, no positive statement, no references for future endeavors. James looked around the table at faces that had once smiled at his innovations, applauded his vision, and trusted his leadership. Now they looked at him like he was a liability to be managed, a problem to be solved. His phone buzzed with a text from Imani. I'm so sorry. This is all my fault. I never should have let you get involved. That was the moment James realized the cruelest truth of all. Derek hadn't just threatened their reputations. He'd succeeded in making them both believe they were the problem. The man who had broken Imani's bones and terrorized her for months had convinced the world that she was the manipulator and James was the predator. I need 24 hours, James said finally. You have until tomorrow morning, Helen replied. But James, if you choose her over the company, there's no coming back from this. Think carefully about what you're willing to lose. As James left the boardroom, he knew the choice wasn't between Imani and his company. It was between love and fear, between standing up for what was right and bowing to what was easy. But the weight of losing everything, his life's work, his employees' jobs, his family's legacy, felt crushing in a way he'd never imagined. For the first time since he'd met Imani, James wondered if loving her was worth destroying everything else he'd ever built. The silence in James's penthouse apartment overlooking the Atlanta skyline was deafening. For 3 days, he'd paced these marble floors, stared out these floor-to-ceiling windows, and wrestled with the most important decision of his life. His phone sat on the kitchen counter, Imani's number pulled up but never dialed, the cursor blinking like his own uncertain heartbeat. She'd been right to feel betrayed. He'd lied to her for weeks, let her pour her heart out to a man she thought was just another struggling worker when he could have solved her problems with a single phone call. The look in her eyes when she'd discovered the truth, the devastation, the humiliation, the way she'd flinched like he'd physically struck her, haunted his every waking moment. You made me feel like a charity case, her words echoed in his memory. Like some poor little project for you to fix. But that wasn't what she was. Not even close. James walked to his home office, where the walls were lined with awards and photos from his business success. 20 restaurants, 800 employees, millions in annual revenue. Accomplishments that had once defined his worth. Now they felt hollow, meaningless without someone to share them with. On his desk lay the private investigator's report he'd commissioned after the hospital. Derek Matthews had a record: 3 domestic violence arrests, 2 convictions, currently on probation. The restraining order Imani had filed was there too, along with the police report from the night her hand was broken. Reading it had made James physically ill. His phone buzzed with a text from his attorney. Derek Matthews violated probation. Arrested this morning. Won't be bothering anyone for the next 2 to 3 years. One problem solved. But the biggest problem remained: how to earn back the trust of the woman he loved. James had spent 72 hours researching everything he could about Imani's situation. The foster care system that had failed her. The lack of affordable housing for single mothers in Atlanta. The healthcare gaps that left pregnant women choosing between doctor visits and rent money. Every statistic broke his heart a little more. But it also showed him what he needed to do. Meanwhile, 3 miles away in her East Point apartment, Imani sat at her small kitchen table, her casted hand resting on a stack of job applications. The medical leave from Morrison's Diner was paid, somehow mysteriously approved despite her being a relatively new employee, but she couldn't go back. Not now. Not knowing that every kindness, every shared laugh, every moment she'd thought was real had been orchestrated by a man who saw her as a problem to solve. The worst part was that she'd been falling in love with him. The busboy Jimmy who remembered how she liked her coffee, who made her laugh during double shifts, who looked at her like she was precious instead of damaged. That man didn't exist. He'd been a role played by a millionaire who could buy and sell her entire world without blinking. Her phone had been ringing constantly. Calls from James Morrison that she refused to answer, voicemails she deleted without listening to. Maria had stopped by twice with updates from the diner, along with gentle suggestions that maybe Imani was being too hard on him. "He's been different since you left," Maria had said during her last visit. "Like a man who lost something he can't replace." But Imani had heard promises before, from foster families who'd seemed caring until she became inconvenient. From Derek, who'd sworn his jealousy was just love and his hands would never hurt her again. She'd learned that when something seemed too good to be true, it usually was. Still, late at night when the baby kicked and she felt most alone, she found herself remembering the way James, had looked at her. The tenderness in his eyes when he'd helped her with that tray. The protective fury when he'd confronted Derek. The gentle way he'd touched her hand in the hospital and promised she'd never have to face anything alone again. What if it had been real? What if the lies about his identity didn't negate the truth of his feelings? Imani shook her head, trying to dispel the dangerous hope. She'd survived this long by trusting no one but herself. She couldn't afford to believe in fairy tales now, not when she had a baby to think about. A knock at her door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. Probably Maria again, or maybe one of the other girls from the diner. But when she looked through the peephole, she saw a delivery woman holding an enormous bouquet of sunflowers. Her favorite, though she'd never told anyone that. "Imani Washington," the woman asked when she opened the door. Yes, but I didn't order anything." "These are from James Morrison. He said to tell you that sunflowers always turn toward the light, just like someone he knows." Imani's breath caught. That first conversation they'd had, when she'd mentioned loving sunflowers because they were brave enough to always look for hope. He'd remembered. With trembling fingers, she opened the small envelope attached to the bouquet. "Imani, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm hoping you'll give me a chance to earn it. I lied about who I was, but I never lied about how I felt about you. You are not a charity case or a project. You are the strongest, most beautiful woman I've ever known, and falling in love with you has been the most honest thing I've ever done. I'm not asking you to trust me again. I know that will take time. But I am asking you to let me prove that love isn't about fixing someone. It's about choosing to build a life together, as equals, with honesty as our foundation. If you're willing to give us a chance, meet me at the diner tomorrow at 8 p.m. If you don't come, I'll understand, and I'll never bother you again. All my love, James. P.S. Derek was arrested this morning. He can't hurt you anymore. Asterisk. Imani sank into her chair, the letter clutched against her chest as tears streamed down her face. He'd remembered the sunflowers. He'd taken care of Derek. He'd called her strong instead of broken. Maybe, just maybe, some fairy tales were worth believing in. The next evening, James sat alone at table 12 in Morrison's diner, watching the clock tick past 8 p.m. The staff had gone home early. He'd given them paid time off, wanting privacy for what might be the most important conversation of his life. 8:15. 8:30. 8:45. Maybe he'd lost her. Maybe the lies had been too much, the betrayal too deep. He couldn't blame her if she never wanted to see him again. At 8:52, the bell above the door chimed. Imani stood in the doorway, her cast bright white against her dark skin, her hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes uncertain but present. She was there. She'd chosen to give him a chance. "I'm sorry I'm late," she said softly, sliding into the seat across from him. "I was trying to decide if I was being brave or stupid." "And what did you decide?" "I decided," Imani said, meeting his eyes for the first time in a week, "that maybe they're the same thing sometimes. And that I've been running from people who wanted to love me for so long that I forgot how to recognize the real thing." James reached across the table, stopping just short of touching her good hand. "Is this real, Imani? Can we make this real?" She looked at him, really looked, and saw not the deceptive millionaire or the fantasy busboy, but the man who defended her, protected her, and somehow managed to love all the broken parts of her. Slowly, carefully, she placed her hand in his. "Let's find out," she whispered, and James felt his heart restart for the first time in a week. 18 months later, the same Morrison's diner in Atlanta that had been the birthplace of their love story was now the setting for their most joyous celebration. The restaurant had been transformed for the occasion. White lights strung between the vintage fixtures, mason jars filled with Georgia peach blossoms on every table, and a beautiful wooden arch adorned with magnolias where the counter used to be. Imani Morrison, the name still felt like a beautiful dream on her tongue, stood in the diner's back office, now converted into a bridal suite, adjusting her flowing ivory dress that accommodated her second pregnancy. At 7 months along, she glowed with the kind of happiness that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. "Mama, you look like a princess." 4-year-old Zara bounced on her toes, her flower girl wearing a miniature version of her mother's gown. The little girl who had once existed only as a dream in Imani's womb was now a vibrant preschooler with her mother's graceful spirit and her adoptive father's gentle heart. James had legally adopted Zara 6 months after their wedding, and watching him read bedtime stories and teach her to ride a bicycle had confirmed what Imani had known from their very first conversation. He was born to be a father, and she was born to love this man. "And Daddy looks handsome too," Imani said, peeking through the office blinds to see James greeting their guests. He'd transformed the diner into their wedding venue because this was where their story began, where a broken hand had led to a healed heart, where pretending to be someone else had led to becoming his truest self. The guest list was a beautiful blend of their two worlds, now permanently merged. James's business associates from across the Southeast sat alongside Imani's former co-workers, who had become her chosen family. Maria, the veteran waitress who had first taught Imani the ropes, served as matron of honor. Tommy, the cook who had made sure she ate during those difficult months, was walking her down the aisle. But the most meaningful presence was Dr. Angela Foster, the physician who had treated Imani's broken hand that first night and had since become both family doctor and close friend. She sat in the front row, beaming with pride at how far they'd all come. Mrs. Morrison, called James's assistant, the same woman who had helped orchestrate his undercover mission. It's time. As the music began, Imani took one last look in the mirror. The reflection showed a woman transformed, not just by love, but by the knowledge that she was worthy of it. The scared, injured waitress who had hidden her pain behind a smile had been replaced by a confident woman who owned her story, all of it. The ceremony was intimate and perfect. James waited at the makeshift altar, tears already streaming down his face as he watched the woman who had changed everything walk toward him. He'd written his vows on the back of an old Morrison's Diner receipt, a touch that made everyone laugh and cry simultaneously. "Imani," he began, his voice steady despite his emotions. 18 months ago, I came to this diner thinking I needed to find my way back to something I'd lost. I never imagined I'd find something I didn't even know I was looking for. A woman whose strength in the face of adversity would teach me what real courage looks like." The congregation was silent, captivated by the raw honesty of his words. You were hiding broken bones and working through pain because you had to. I was hiding my identity because I wanted to. But somehow, two people pretending to be someone else found the most authentic love either of us had ever experienced. Imani's turn came next, and she spoke without notes, straight from her heart. "James, when you found me that night broken and afraid, you didn't just fix my hand. You fixed my faith in humanity. You showed me that love doesn't have to hurt, that protection doesn't require possession, and that family isn't just about blood, it's about choice." She paused, her hand instinctively moving to her growing belly. "You chose me when I was at my lowest. You chose Zara before she was even born. And now you're choosing this new little one growing inside me. But more than that, you've chosen to use your privilege to lift others up. Our scholarship program has sent 12 young people to college. Our employee assistance fund has helped dozens of families. And this diner continues to be a place where everyone is treated with dignity." The kiss that sealed their vows was witnessed by 100 guests, but it felt as intimate as their first kiss in the hospital, when they'd realized that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the scariest moments. As the reception began, the diner filled with laughter, music, and the kind of joy that comes from watching two people who almost missed each other find their forever. The same booth where James had first watched Imani work now held their wedding cake, a simple but elegant creation from the bakery down the street that had donated their services. "Daddy, dance with me." Zara tugged on James's sleeve, and he swept her up in his arms for their special father-daughter dance. Watching her husband spin their daughter around the makeshift dance floor, Imani felt the baby kick, as if celebrating along with them. "You did good, Mija," Maria whispered, appearing at Imani's side with 2 cups of the diner's famous sweet tea. "That man looks at you like you hung the moon." "He looks at all of us that way," Imani replied, watching James now dancing with some of the elderly customers who had become extended family. "He sees the best in everyone. It's what makes him so dangerous to fall in love with." Do you believe that sometimes we have to be broken before we can be truly whole? Share your thoughts about second chances and unexpected love in the comments below. As the evening wound down, James and Imani stood together behind the counter where she'd once served him coffee without knowing who he was. The diner would reopen tomorrow, back to serving the community that had embraced their love story, but tonight it belonged entirely to their celebration of commitment and family. Any regrets? James asked, pulling her close as their guests danced around them. Only one, Imani smiled, her hands finding his. I regret that it took breaking my hand to realize I deserved to be treated like I was precious. You are precious, he whispered against her forehead. You and Zara and this little one. You're my whole world. The same diner where Imani had once hidden her broken bones and worked through pain now witnessed their promises of forever. The booth where she'd served countless customers while secretly falling for the mysterious busboy now held their wedding gifts, donations to various charities in lieu of traditional presents, because their greatest gift was the love they'd found in each other. As they swayed together to the soft music, surrounded by the people who had become their family, James and Imani Morrison knew that their story was far from over. It was just the beginning. A love story that had started with deception and pain but had grown into the kind of authentic, transformative love that changes not just two people, but everyone lucky enough to witness it. The undercover mission that had begun as James's attempt to reconnect with his business had instead taught him the most important lesson of his life. That real wealth wasn't measured in restaurants or revenue, but in the trust of a woman brave enough to love again, the laughter of a daughter who chose you as her father, and the knowledge that every day forward would be better than every day behind. Some love stories begin with grand gestures and perfect moments. Theirs began with a broken hand, a hidden identity, and the radical act of seeing each other's full humanity in a world that often values what you do more than who you are. But that foundation, built on truth revealed, pain acknowledged, and courage rewarded, proved unshakable, creating a love that would last not just for their lifetime, but for generations of Morrison's Diner customers who would hear their story and believe, maybe for the first time, that love really could conquer all. Thanks for sticking with this story till the very end. But trust me, you haven't seen anything yet. The next story is crazier, more shocking, and will blow your mind. Click the image on your screen now and dive right in. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a single twist.